I grew up in New York City, but my story isn't one of skyscrapers or bright lights. It's a story of loss, hardship, and an unspoken love that I only came to understand much later. My name is Sarah, and I was 6 years old when my world was shattered. I was young, too young to truly grasp what was happening, but old enough to feel the hole that appeared in my heart the day my parents died. It was a rainy evening. One of those days when the city felt a little quieter, a little colder. My parents had taken me to the park, nothing special. Just a quick trip before dinner. It was the last memory I have of them. The sound of their laughter mixing with the soft patter of raindrops. But as we crossed a busy intersection on our way home, a car lost control on the slick road and struck them. I don't remember much after that. What I do remember is the shock. The deep, aching silence that followed the accident. And the feeling that something was missing. Something I would never get back. Jake, my older brother, was just 14 at the time. He was there when it happened. I didn't know it then. But that one traumatic event would change the trajectory of both our lives forever. I remember the days after the funeral. The house that once felt so full of life now felt empty and cold. Our parents were gone. And in the midst of the grief and confusion, there was Jake, who tried to fill the void, who tried to make things right. He was just a boy, too, only a few years older than me. But in those early days, he was the one who took on the weight of responsibility. I don't think he knew what it meant to be a parent to me, but he tried his best. He fed me, made sure I had my school uniform ready in the morning, and even tucked me in at night. He didn't smile much, but I could see how hard he tried to keep everything together. Jake stopped going to school. He took on small jobs, anything he could find, to make sure we didn't go hungry. He would run errands for neighbors, shovel snow in the winter, and sometimes help with car repairs at the local garage. There were times I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness that seemed to get worse every day. But he never complained. He just kept working. Kept going. And I, in my childish ignorance, never truly understood the weight of it. I never saw how much he sacrificed to care for me. I was too young to realize what it meant when Jake stopped going to school. Too young to understand that his future was slipping through his fingers with each passing day. For me, all I knew was that Jake was the one constant in my life. He was the one person who didn't leave me. The one who made sure I had what I needed. But as I got older, I began to see cracks in his strength. I saw the loneliness in his eyes, the kind of loneliness that only comes from too much responsibility, from too many sleepless nights, from carrying the weight of a world that wasn't meant for him. And then, one night, it happened. It wasn't a big fight. No harsh words. No dramatic outbursts. Just a moment of exhaustion. A single spark that ignited everything. I was being difficult. I was angry. Angry at the world for taking our parents. Angry at Jake for being so tired. I had begun to feel like a burden. Like I was just one more thing for him to carry. I didn't know how to voice it. But it was there, this growing resentment. This hurt that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just the pain of being alone. Of feeling like I had no one left who truly cared for me. Jake lost his patience that night. He yelled at me, his voice raw with frustration. "I can't do this anymore. Sarah," he shouted. And for the first time, I saw the cracks in his armor. His face was filled with exhaustion. But there was something else. Something I hadn't seen before, guilt. His voice softened. And he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself, "I'm not enough. I can't do this alone." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make him understand that I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at the world. At life for taking everything from us. But I didn't have the words. All I had was silence. And in that silence, Jake made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. He decided to send me to live with our aunt and uncle. He told me it was for the best. That they could provide a better life for me. A life where I wouldn't have to worry about bills or food or anything. He told me that he couldn't be the father I needed. That he couldn't be both a brother and a parent to me. I remember how I felt when he told me. It was as if my heart was being ripped out. And I couldn't breathe. I didn't understand why he was making that choice. And I couldn't accept it. He was my brother. My only family. How could he just send me away? Jake's sacrifice was clear. But I couldn't see it then. All I saw was abandonment. All I felt was betrayal. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling the weight of an entire world crashing down on me. My brother, the one person who had always been there for me, had given up on me. He had chosen to let me go, to let someone else take care of me, and I didn't know how to forgive him for it. But life moves on. Even when we don't want it to. I went to live with our aunt and uncle. And though they were kind, I never truly felt at home. I missed Jake with every fiber of my being. The days passed. And I buried my feelings deep inside, not wanting to face the truth that my brother had sacrificed his future for mine. That he had let me go so I could have a chance at a better life. I didn't understand it then. But over time, I began to realize something important. Jake's sacrifice was the truest form of love he could give me. It wasn't about abandoning me, it was about giving me the chance to have a life he couldn't give me. But it would take me years. Years of pain and confusion. To finally see that. After our parents died, Jake became my everything. My brother. My protector. My caretaker. But what I didn't realize at the time was that he was also just a boy, only 14 years old, thrust into the role of a parent far too soon. He tried to shield me from the worst of it. But the weight of responsibility wore him down day by day. Jake dropped out of school without hesitation, thinking only of how he could make ends meet. He worked tirelessly, taking on whatever odd jobs he could find, delivering groceries, cleaning garages, even carrying heavy loads for construction crews. I used to wonder why Jake always came home so late or why his clothes were often stained with dirt and sweat. Back then, I didn't understand that he was doing it all for me. There were days when Jake came home with little more than a few dollars, barely enough to buy groceries. He'd look at me with tired eyes, give me a small smile, and say, "We'll figure it out, Sarah." And somehow, he always did. He made sure I had dinner, even if it meant skipping meals himself. He made sure my school fees were paid, even if it meant wearing the same pair of shoes until they fell apart. But Jake was just a kid. The exhaustion started to show, creeping into his voice, his posture, and the way he looked at the world. He carried his burden silently, but I could see it. I could feel it in the way he sat at the kitchen table at night, his head in his hands, as though the weight of our circumstances was pressing down on him like a mountain. One night, everything came to a head. I was upset because I wanted something, a toy, a treat. I can't even remember now, but I remember how Jake reacted. He slammed his hands on the table, his voice shaking with frustration. "Sarah, I can't do this anymore," he shouted. His words hit me like a slap. Not because they were loud, but because they were raw, filled with a pain I hadn't seen before. He softened almost immediately, but the damage was done. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting down and burying his face in his hands. I'm not enough. I'm trying. But it's not enough." I wanted to tell him that he was enough, that he didn't need to be perfect. But I didn't know how. I was just a child. And all I could do was cry. The next morning, Jake told me his decision. "Sarah, you're going to live with Aunt Susan and Uncle David," he said. His voice steady but his eyes betraying his sorrow. "They can take care of you better than I can." I refused to believe it at first. "No, you can't just send me away," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "You're my brother. You're all I have." Jake didn't argue. He just pulled me into a hug, holding me tightly as I cried. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered. "That's why I have to do this. You deserve better than what I can give you." I didn't understand then. All I felt was anger and betrayal. How could he let me go? How could he think that sending me away was what I needed? I felt abandoned. Like I wasn't worth fighting for. I didn't realize that letting me go was the hardest decision he had ever made. Jake took me to Aunt Susan and Uncle David's house the following week. He stayed just long enough to make sure I was settled before leaving without saying goodbye. I watched him walk away from the window. His shoulders slumped. His hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't look back. 4 years. I held on to that image, convinced that he had chosen to leave me because he didn't care enough to stay. I didn't see the truth until much later that Jake hadn't left because he didn't love me. He had left because he loved me more than anything. And he thought it was the only way to give me a better life. Living with Aunt Susan and Uncle David was a strange experience. They were kind. But it never felt like home. No matter how much they tried to make me feel welcome. The void left by Jake's absence never disappeared. I missed him in ways I couldn't explain. I felt like a puzzle missing a piece, something essential was always out of reach. Aunt Susan would tell me, "We're here for you, Sarah. Your family." But the truth was, I didn't want to be part of anyone else's family. My heart was still with Jake. And it was hard for me to accept that he wasn't there. That he hadn't come back for me. Every night, I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts drifting to him. Was he okay? Had he found a way to make his life better? I wanted to believe he was okay. But the pain of being separated from him was like a constant ache in my chest. As time went on, I started to withdraw further into myself. I made fewer friends at school. And when I did, I kept them at arm's length. The kids at school didn't understand. How could they? They had their parents. They didn't know what it was like to be alone in the world at such a young age. The loneliness I felt was deep and suffocating. And I didn't know how to share it with anyone. Aunt Susan and Uncle David tried their best to support me. But I couldn't allow myself to rely on them fully. I had to be strong on my own. That's what Jake had taught me. Even if he didn't mean to. He had taught me that survival came from within. From relying on yourself and not depending on others. I became more self-sufficient. Learning to manage things on my own. I started taking care of the house chores. Doing my own laundry. Cooking dinner. And handling my schoolwork without asking for help. It wasn't always easy. But I was determined not to be a burden. I buried myself in my studies. Working hard to prove that I could succeed. Even without Jake by my side. But the anger was still there. I couldn't forgive Jake for leaving me. Not fully. I told myself that he had chosen his own path and left me behind. I wasn't sure whether he had made the right choice. But I was too hurt to consider that he had done it out of love. And yet, despite everything, a small part of me still held on to the hope that one day, he would come back. I didn't know how or when. But I believed that the bond between us was unbreakable. I thought that maybe, if I proved myself strong enough, Jake would see that I had grown, that I was capable of taking care of myself, and he would come back for me. Then, when I was 18, Aunt Susan sat me down one evening. "Sarah, your brother sent something for you," she said. Her voice filled with something I couldn't place. She handed me an envelope, and my heart stopped. It was from Jake. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, written in Jake's familiar handwriting. "Sarah, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I want you to know that everything I did for you. I couldn't give you the life you deserved. And I had to let you go. I've missed you every single day since. I hope you've found happiness. I hope you've found peace. Please know that I will always love you. No matter where we are." Tears filled my eyes as I read those words over and over. In that moment, I understood. Jake hadn't abandoned me. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own future. Because he loved me. He had done the hardest thing a brother could do. He let me go so that I could have the chance to grow. To be free from the struggles that had bound us together. I cried for a long time that night, not out of anger, but out of relief. I cried because I realized that I had been carrying the burden of bitterness for so long, when all along, Jake had been carrying the heaviest burden of all. He had made the choice to set me free, even if it meant his own heart would break. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I had grown. I had learned. And now, maybe, it was time for me to find Jake, to forgive him, to tell him that I understood. I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore. There was a part of me that wanted to forget about the past and just move forward with my life. I'd spent so many years holding on to pain and resentment. And now, after reading Jake's letter, I didn't know where to go next. It felt like the universe had dropped a weight from my shoulders. But the emptiness still remained. The ache of missing him. The ache of not knowing if I could ever truly forgive him for leaving me, it was all still there. Aunt Susan tried to talk to me, but I wasn't ready to face her. Not yet. I needed time to process everything, to figure out what I wanted. But then, a week later, something happened that pushed me toward a decision I hadn't anticipated. I found myself sitting in the kitchen, staring at the letter again. When Aunt Susan brought up college, "You know, Jake sent money for your tuition," she said softly, almost hesitantly, as if she was afraid of pushing me too hard. "He wanted you to have a future. Sarah, you've got the grades to go. He believed in you. I think it's time you believed in yourself too." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had been avoiding the idea of college for so long, telling myself that I wasn't ready, that I didn't need to go, that maybe it wasn't worth it without Jake by my side. But Aunt Susan was right. Jake had believed in me, and, deep down, I knew he had made that sacrifice for my future, not for his own. He had sent me the money because he had hoped I would take that next step. "I don't know if I can do this, Aunt Susan," I whispered, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "You don't have to do it alone, Sarah. You never have to do anything alone. But if you don't try, if you don't follow what Jake wanted for you, then you're letting his sacrifice go to waste." Her words settled in my chest. I thought about Jake, how much he had given up, and how much I owed to his love and sacrifice. It wasn't just about going to college anymore, it was about honoring everything he had done for me. It was about finding my own path, just as he had done. And maybe, in the process, I would learn how to forgive him. The decision to apply wasn't easy, but it felt like the right one. The next day, I filled out my college applications. One for a school in Boston, where I had always wanted to go. It wasn't just a random choice. There was something about the city, something that called to me. Maybe it was the history, the promise of new beginnings, the idea of a fresh start in a place that felt different from everything I had known. I could almost imagine Jake's voice, telling me to go, to pursue my dreams, to make something of myself. I wrote my personal statement, pouring my heart into it. I didn't shy away from mentioning my family, my struggles, and my relationship with Jake. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready to face the future, even if it meant doing it alone. For the first time, I wasn't doing it to prove anything to anyone else. I was doing it for myself and for Jake. I remember the day I received my acceptance letter. A month after I submitted my application, Aunt Susan called me into the living room, holding the envelope. My heart raced as I took it from her hands. I tore it open. The words "Congratulations, you've been accepted" jumping out at me like a beacon of light. It was surreal. All those years of uncertainty, all those moments of doubt and fear, had led to this moment. I had made it. And in that moment, I realized that my journey was just beginning. College wasn't just about education. It was a symbol of my growth, of my independence, and of the love that Jake had always shown me, even in the silence of his absence. I looked at Aunt Susan, my eyes welling up with gratitude. "I did it," I whispered. "I'm going." Her smile was gentle, knowing. "You did it, Sarah. And I know Jake is proud of you." For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making the right decision. College was the next step, and it was a chance for me to continue the journey of healing, of finding myself, and of honoring the love that had shaped my life. But it wasn't just about the future, it was also about reconciling with the past. It was about letting go of the pain and anger I had carried for so long, and learning how to forgive, how to truly move forward. It was time to start my new chapter. It was time to make Jake proud. Boston was everything I'd hoped for: new, bright, bustling with life in ways that felt fresh and full of promise. But as much as I tried to immerse myself in the rhythm of college life, Jake's absence remained like a shadow that followed me everywhere. I'd gone there with a purpose, to honor his sacrifice, to prove to myself that I could be more than the sum of my pain. Yet, I still carried him with me, in the deepest corners of my heart. The first few weeks on campus were a blur: meetings, new classes, introductions to strangers who didn't yet know my story. It felt like everyone around me was moving forward, their lives unfolding in the way I had always imagined mine would. But for me, there was a gap, a void where my brother should have been, where the past still clung to me like an old, uncomfortable coat. I had a room in a shared dorm with two other girls who were kind and welcoming, but it was clear they didn't fully understand my struggle. To them, I was just another college student, someone who had everything ahead of her, who could leave her past behind. And that's what I tried to do sometimes. But there were moments, late at night when the weight of loneliness pressed in, when I found myself reaching for the phone, wanting to call Jake, wanting to hear his voice telling me that everything was going to be okay. One evening, after weeks of sleepless nights and restless days, I was walking across campus when something caught my eye: an article pinned to a bulletin board in the student union. The headline was simple: "A mechanic's story, lost limb, found purpose." The photo accompanying it showed a man with one arm, standing proudly next to a row of bicycles he had clearly repaired. The face was somewhat obscured by the angle, but I couldn't help but stare at it for a moment longer than usual. There was something familiar in those eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It had to be a coincidence, I told myself. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people who had lost limbs in accidents. But my heart fluttered in my chest as I looked closer. I took a photo of the article and stored it in my phone, telling myself I'd check it out later. But the thought stayed with me. What if this was him? What if this was Jake? The next few days were filled with a strange urgency. I couldn't shake the feeling that the universe was trying to tell me something. I kept thinking back to the photo, the scarred but determined face, the one arm holding a wrench with quiet confidence. I knew I had to follow this lead, even if it seemed like a long shot. I spent hours searching online, trying to track down more information. But it wasn't until a few days later, when I found an address linked to the mechanic's workshop, that the pieces fell into place. It wasn't far from the college, just a short bus ride across the city. My heart raced as I made plans to visit the place the next day. The morning I left, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Part of me was still unsure, still questioning whether I was chasing a fantasy. But the other part, perhaps the stronger part, felt a deep pull toward this unknown. What if this was Jake? What if all this time, all the years of silence, had finally led me to him? As I walked toward the address, I remembered the stories he used to tell me, the ones about his dream of becoming a mechanic, of fixing things, of building a life. Could this be the life he had built for himself? Could this be my brother, the one who had disappeared into the world, leaving me with nothing but questions and broken promises? I didn't know what I was about to find, but in that moment, I was ready to discover whatever truth awaited me. This was the first step in bringing Jake back into my life, or at least, in finding out why he had left in the first place. The mechanic's shop was a small, unassuming place tucked between two larger buildings on the outskirts of the city. Its windows were dusted over with years of grease and grime, but inside, the atmosphere was warm, filled with the scent of metal and motor oil. As I pushed open the door, the sound of tools clinking and the steady hum of an old engine filled the air. My heart beat louder in my chest as I stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a man, his back to me, focused on the work he was doing. He had short, dark hair and wore a faded blue work shirt. He looked like any mechanic. His face slightly weathered but strong, hands calloused from years of hard work. But something about him felt familiar. I hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to say or how to begin. I didn't even know if I was making the right decision. What if this wasn't Jake? What if I had built up a false hope for nothing? I took a deep breath, and before I could stop myself, I called out, "Jake!" The man froze. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. He slowly turned around, and my breath caught in my throat as I locked eyes with him. The years had changed him. Of course, he had the grizzled look of someone who had lived hard. Someone who had been through things that I could barely imagine. But those eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes I had looked into every day of my childhood. "Sarah." His voice cracked with disbelief. "Is that really you?" I nodded, my throat tightening as I took a step forward. There he was, standing right in front of me. My brother, the one I had spent all these years searching for. 1,000 emotions rushed through me in that instant: relief, anger, sadness, confusion. I wanted to run to him, throw my arms around him and never let go. But at the same time, I felt a wall between us, a distance that I wasn't sure how to bridge. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to process the sight of me standing there. I could see that the years had been hard on him, harder than they had been on me. His face was more lined, his body thinner, but there was still something deeply familiar about him. It was as though a part of him had always been waiting for me, just like I had been waiting for him. I never thought I'd see you again," Jake finally said, his voice low, full of emotion. He wiped his hands on his pants and stepped toward me, his gaze flickering between me and the space around us, as if unsure what to do next. I started, my voice trembling. "I've been looking for you, Jake, for so long." I know," he interrupted gently. "I know you have." He let out a long breath, looking down at the ground for a moment before lifting his head again. "I didn't want you to look for me. I didn't want to drag you into this mess." The words stung, but I understood. I had always known that whatever had happened to him, whatever had caused him to leave, it hadn't been easy. I knew he hadn't disappeared just to hurt me. He had his own reasons, his own battles. "Why, Jake?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of sadness and regret. Then, slowly, he led me to a bench in the back of the shop, and we sat down together. The years that had separated us didn't matter in that moment. It was just the two of us, alone in this small room, with the sounds of the shop echoing around us. "I thought I was doing what was best for you," he said quietly. "I couldn't take care of you the way you deserved. I couldn't even take care of myself. I thought if I left, you'd have a chance at a better life. I didn't want you to live like I was living, in a world that felt so dark and hopeless." His words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on both of us. I understood now. He had made the decision out of love, even if it had hurt us both. He had thought he was protecting me by staying away, by leaving behind the life we had known. But in doing so, he had left me with a hole in my heart that I had spent years trying to fill. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I'm sorry for everything." Tears welled in my eyes as I reached out to him. "You don't have to apologize, Jake. I just want to understand. I want to know you again. I want us to be a family." For a moment, we sat in silence, just letting the past settle between us. I realized that no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much pain we had endured, We still had a chance to rebuild. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe it wouldn't be the way we had imagined. But we were here. Together. And that was enough for me. As I sat there beside Jake, I could feel the weight of the years lifting off my shoulders. Bit by bit. We had finally come face to face with the truths we had buried deep inside ourselves for so long. There was so much we had both missed. So much time we couldn't get back. But somehow, in this small mechanic shop with the smell of motor oil and the hum of distant traffic, I realized that we were both exactly where we needed to be. I looked at Jake. Now seeing him for the man he had become. He wasn't the boy I had once idolized, his life had shaped him differently. Hardened him in ways I couldn't have imagined. But he was still my brother. The person who had once taken on the world for me. Even if he had walked away from me. Even if we had lost all those years. The love and the bond we shared couldn't just disappear. The gap between us was not just physical, it was emotional. Built on guilt and misunderstanding. But now it was something we could work through. I understood. In that moment. That love doesn't always come in perfect packages. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's painful. But it's always worth fighting for. Jake had fought for me in his own way. Even if it meant sacrificing himself. And now, I had to fight for him. We both had to fight for the chance to heal. To rebuild what we had lost. But the question that echoed in my mind, the lesson I had learned from this journey, was simple: what is the cost of love? For Jake. The lesson was clearer than he had expected. As I sat there, watching him reflect on the choices he had made, I could see the regret in his eyes. The burden he carried for all those years. He had thought that leaving me behind was the only way to protect me. He had chosen isolation, hoping that by distancing himself, I would have the life he couldn't provide. But over time, he had realized that isolation is never the answer to love. Love is not about making the hard choices alone. It's about sharing those burdens. About letting others in. Even when it feels too difficult. Jake looked at me, his eyes a little red, and said, "I've spent so many years thinking I was doing the right thing. I thought I was saving you from the life I had. But in the end, I realized I wasn't saving you at all. I was just running away from my own fears. And that's not love. Love is about being there. Even when it's hard. It's about facing the hard truths together." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I've learned that. Even if I couldn't be perfect for you, I could have at least been present. That's what matters. For me." The lesson was a little more complicated. More nuanced. In the years I had spent searching for Jake, I had convinced myself that my anger and resentment were justified. I had buried myself in bitterness. Convinced that he had abandoned me. And I had let that bitterness define me. I had built walls so high that no one could see the girl I used to be. The girl who had once believed in family and unconditional love. But sitting there, with Jake beside me, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just for him. It was for me. Holding on to anger and hurt only kept me in the past. Chained to memories that I couldn't change. If I truly wanted to move forward, I needed to let go of the resentment that had weighed me down for so long. I needed to forgive him. And more importantly, I needed to forgive myself. "Jake," I said softly, "I didn't understand why you left. I hated you for it. But I know now, it wasn't because you didn't love me. It was because you loved me so much that you thought leaving was the only way to protect me. And I've carried that hate for so long. I didn't realize it was just holding me back." I paused, letting the words settle in. Forgiving you is not about saying everything's okay. It's about accepting the truth. Accepting that we've both made mistakes. But we still have time. Jake. We still have time to rebuild. In the end, the lessons we learned were simple but profound. For Jake, it was about being present. About letting love guide your choices. Not fear. For me, it was about forgiveness, not just of him, but of myself. Our journey had taught us that family doesn't always fit the picture you expect. That love can be messy, and that healing takes time. But the most important lesson we learned was that no matter what had happened in the past, we had the power to change the future. As we stood up to leave the shop, side by side, I realized that this was only the beginning. Our relationship wouldn't be perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. Together, we would face whatever life had in store, and we would do it as a family, stronger than before, wiser for having lived through the struggle, and forever bound by the love that had brought us back together.